Welcome to Bake This Book. My name's Erik Fabian. I'm a home baker and co-founder of Sour House. Today, we're going to be talking with cookbook authors, folks who focus on naturally fermented sourdough breads and pastries. We're going to talk about their books, how they were made, the recipes inside, and tips for making your next bake a really great bake. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm very excited today to check in with my friend, Daniel Leader. We're going to be chatting about his most recent book, A Slow Rise, Favorite Recipes from 4 Decades of Baking with the Heart, published by Avery, as well as just like talking about his long career now of publishing cookbooks and being a baker. If you're not familiar with Daniel Leader, he is the founder of Bread Alone Bakery up in New York. Back in the early 80s, Bread Alone was one of those kind of like pioneering bakeries that really helped bring what we now kind of understand artisan bread baking, organic bread baking into the minds of American bakers. And his first book, Bread Alone, was really one of those seminal books that kind of introduced sourdough baking, artisan baking to the world. He retired in 2019 and passed the Bread Alone empire to his son. And that same year, in 2019, he won a James Beard Award for his book, Living Bread. So Dan has a lot of perspective on the sourdough world, and I'm really excited to chat with him. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Erik. So good to be here.
Awesome. Good to see you. So before we get into your books and the history of sourdough, I want to just set the stage here and imagine with me for a minute that we are in the kitchen with a home baker. They've just been pulling the flour out of the shelves and, getting their supplies together to bake. And you're in there with them. What tip would you give this baker to have a really great bake today?
I mean, the first thing is, bread is always this balance between science and art. So I always start with the science, being very accurate about scaling, always going metric, always use a digital scale, and be consistent about your ingredients. If you're using flour from central milling, always use flour from central milling. Have that be your go-to. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't try new things, but if you want to have a really good bake, a really consistent bake, you need to be consistent about your ingredients. It's so interesting if I think about my entire career and all the mistakes that I've made over, almost 50 years. Almost every mistake is because I scaled wrong, or I used the wrong temperature, or I wasn't monitoring those really core principles of baking. So, I joke with people that to be a good baker, in a way, it's a really boring job because you do the same thing at the same time, at the same temperature, at the same intervals every day. And so don't be afraid of the consistency and don't jump quickly to be creative. Make that perfect loaf. There is no perfect loaf. Make that really good loaf of sourdough bread and live with it and enjoy it and make little modifications, but get that core loaf down. And then there's lots and lots of time for creativity, but following the fundamentals is the most critical part of bread baking.
It's funny how, when you first learn to bake a loaf of sourdough bread, it can be quite intimidating because it, has kind of a long timeline. And even though there's very simple ingredients, it seems like there's lots of little nuances to make it work. And getting those first couple loaves out of the way makes a huge difference in, I think, people's confidence. But then that next thing is really reducing the variables and finding ways to keep things consistent.
Right. I mean, just for example, you've made your good loaf of sourdough bread, but you really don't have deep information. You've seen the sourdough rise, you've seen the size of the bubbles, you can taste it, but you have a lot of empirical information, not a lot of scientific information. Of course, you can find out about the principles of the flour if you get a farina graph or an Elvia graph. But even something as simple as a pH meter can dramatically improve your sourdough bread because, your sourdough might look really bubbly and really alive, and you go to check the pH and it's only 4.4. Well, if you waited 45 minutes or an hour, it might be down to 4.1, and then that's going to have a different impact. But I don't say to people, don't dive into that too quickly, because you can make a very respectable loaf of bread without that technical information. But as you go, you can add layers of information to your process.
I want to talk about the layers with you that you've accumulated over the last
Right.
40 some years of baking. And so I think this is a great place to start. And your newest book, A Slow Rise, has kind of an extended introduction that really talks about your personal history as a baker, discovering bread, and your education, how you accumulated some of these layers over the years. And just to kind of give us some bookends, like the bread you were baking in the early 90s, 93, versus the bread you're baking today, how has that changed? Like what are those layers that make you a different baker today than you were then?
When we started, we just had plastic buckets and like an average home baker. So think about in your world before you had this wonderful gadget to make, to maintain the sourdough. People were just doing it in a bowl or a ball jar, and it worked. But what you do is better. So like in the beginning, we didn't have fermentation tanks for making sourdough. We didn't have thermostatically controlled boxes to raise our firm sourdough. So, we've added technical expertise, but the process is still the same. Our stiff sourdough is still a 65% hydration. Our liquid sourdough is still 100% hydration. But we're able to control it in a much more precise way because we have these thermal jacketed stainless steel sourdough tanks. So which makes the sourdough very consistent every single day.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, as somebody who makes tools for sourdough bakers, we obviously are trying to help bring a few of those simpler ideas to the home baker to help control temperature and such. And that's the same, I guess, principle that I approach our work with is like I don't want to replace the baking process for people. I don't want to create bread machines. I want to give people some handrails to help
Hmm.
them bake the bread they want to bake. And I also know that part of that, in my experience, helping people get started baking is that there's a lot of sensory signals from bread that are useful to understand, but hard to conceptualize until you've touched the dough at different stages and you've seen the bubbles. And it's hard to get across in cookbooks, I imagine. And by giving, obviously tools and tips and that kind of stuff, we can help them kind of get into that zone and experience those sensory cues more quickly. You talk a lot about the soft skills of baking in this book as well. So, in parallel with the increase of technology and the knowledge that we get from that, it seems like there's a lot in this book about just noticing and kind of like watching the bread and your dough at different stages and accumulating that sensory knowledge as mindfully and as quickly as possible. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I think it's especially important, I think, in this crazy fast-paced world that we're living in now, where everything is like instantaneous and, the information is changing so quickly. I don't think on a day-to-day basis, the kind of gentle concentration, if I could say, when you're making bread, it's a very gentle process. You mix flour and water together to make the autolyse. Okay. You bring it together. You stop, you feel the dough. Well, does it feel different from yesterday? Does it feel different from last week? Is the flour different? Just taking the time to do that. And then, after the autolyse, adding in your sourdough and folding it in. I mean, this is a very, it's a primal activity. It's a gentle activity. It's an activity that if you don't pay attention, you miss the signals. And so I actually think for today's world, sourdough bread baking is just a great way to keep our minds healthy
Hmm.
because we're forced to slow down, we're forced to focus, we're forced to be patient because this process, I mean, okay, we have this new style of baking where we proof the bread for a long time and then we shape it and we put it in the refrigerator overnight, and it can take a day and a half to make a loaf of sourdough bread, but you can also make a loaf of sourdough bread in 8 hours,
Yep.
if you don't refrigerate it. And so all these clues that you're going to get along the process, you're giving your dough a fold every 45 minutes. Well, I've certainly done that in times. Well, wait a second. By the third fold, the dough feels a little bucky. What's different? Oh, I checked the temperature. The kitchen got a little warm and it accelerated the fermentation. I didn't do anything different. I still was doing folds every 45 minutes and it feels different. So what do? Oh, wait a second. This dough is a little warm. It's 83 degrees. My kitchen's warm. Oh, wait a second. I'll put it in the fridge for half an hour and slow it down. So you really have to pay attention if you want to understand the nuances.
It's interesting you say that because I'm reminded that you mentioned in the prologue of your book, the Tassajara bread book by Ed Brown.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it feels like the first points of inspiration that were with you many years ago have still kind of stuck with you in the sense of like this noticing, and that book has like its influence has continued to trickle through decades later.
Yeah. It was very interesting because I interviewed Edward S. Brown before I wrote this book.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And, I told him what it influenced his book was on me, because it wasn't just about baking bread. It was the consciousness of baking bread. It was like really being in tune with the bread, being one with the bread, being like fully, like if you could put your awareness in a loaf of bread, that's what that book said to me.
Wow.
And it was very interesting to hear him talk about that and why he wrote the book that way. And he was not a trained baker. He's a Zen monk who decided to bake bread.
Right. So you've written many books. Why did you feel like you wanted to write this one now?
I knew my career was winding down. I mean, listen, bread baking is a really hard career.
Mm-hmm.
All these people who are diving into the industry now need to be prepared. It's really hard work. It's nights, it's weekends, it's 24 hours a day. Even if you're closed 2 days a week, someone's got to come in on your days off to mix the sourdough. You've got to make all the bread the day before your production starts. It's hard work. And I realized that for my health, it was time to like slow down. And so I just felt like I wanted to, exit my life as a professional baker, kind of with a farewell few words, and to kind of like, did I miss anything? What would I like to add? I have an interesting chapter about this group in France that has a new way of baking bread using whole grains in their sourdough. And I wrote about a research group in Mexico that is doing research on how to raise wheat in this in global warming. So I really tried to go far in terms of the information. And I also did something fun. I snuck my way into the Grand Prix de la Baguette in Paris, and I wrote about that experience. So there's some really fun parts of the book, and there's some really, really interesting and serious parts of the book.
Interesting. So my two questions come up immediately. It's like, so really, this is your last book? Did you
Yep.
put the period on the sentence? Wow. So we have your full opus to consider. The other thing is, I hear you talk about some of these areas of interest with this book. And as I was doing kind of a review of Bread Alone, some of the contrasts kind of stood out to me. And a couple that, come to mind initially is like Bread Alone, in some ways, I feel like sets a template for a lot of the baking books that we see today. Like you think of Tartine Bread and, other kind of popular books where there's the story of the professional baker in the bakery. You open with the story of like bread in the oven and kind of bringing it out and the romance of that. And there's a whole chapter on your bakery. There's a chapter on building brick ovens, and you talk about a mason that builds oven at that time. And then also you're kind of introducing people into bread from the fields to the kitchen. And so at that time, I can feel like introducing organic is sort of like the touchstone, whereas like now with Slow Rise, we've progressed to the point where you're talking about more local grains. You're talking about some of these new frontiers in baking. And in some ways, you're still kind of, I can feel you still being an advocate and kind of helping push the field forward with with this book in the same way you were doing back then. But the world's so different. People just didn't have the same context back then.
Oh, not at all. I mean, not only did they didn't even have the vocabulary. When we started selling baguettes, people were like, what? I mean, literally, when we start sourdough bread, what's that? A miche? I mean, now I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say that if you said miche to any, serious home baker, they're going to know exactly what it is. Back then, nobody had to. We actually had to change the name of the bread. So when we started making a whole wheat sourdough, bread inspired by poêlin, we called it a miche. It didn't sell. When we called it whole wheat sourdough bread, it sold.
Right. That's classic. If you're a younger person and even younger than me, like I was in high school in like the early 90s, and just to frame this for you, like obviously there was no internet then, it was just beginning. If you were into food like I was as a young person, you were watching like PBS cooking shows and reading cookbooks, and like these were really the place that information was distributed. I think also the food culture was very different, not just with bread, but in general, it's like sushi was just starting to kind of arrive, and there was still, I think, a lot of fascination with Europe, but we were past that like 80s like French kind of moment and the like California cuisine kind of thing, and organic was just starting to come around. So there was a little bit of like a multi-culti kind of ethnic food interest, I think, in the popular food culture. But there was just not as much information. And the same thing with bread is like, I don't know if I'd had even like a San Francisco style sourdough loaf at that point in my
And
life.
actually, at that point, I mean, if you went to San Francisco, Acme opened the same year as Bread Alone. But if you
Uh-huh.
went to San Francisco in 1983 before Acme, you had to go to get that Boudin San Francisco sourdough. There's nothing wrong with it, but it was a white loaf of sourdough bread.
Yeah, totally. And so that was like bread. Like there was like,
Exactly.
Wonder Bread in the stores and variations of that.
Yeah.
And then there was the sour white San Francisco loaf. And then we have the beginning of this like artesian
Yeah.
type bread with using more whole grains,
Yeah.
kind of pulling from the like hippie bread kind of tradition of the 60s and 70s, but then still connected to France. And I
Yeah.
feel like you are somebody who seems to really gotten enamored with France at a certain point in your career.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about these kind of flows of information and how that happened?
Yeah. I mean, so I consider myself lucky that the internet did not exist when I started, because there weren't any books. If you wanted to read about sourdough baking in late 70s, there were no books. The Clayton book, I think the Books of France came out. There was Beard on Bread, but there was no information on sourdough. It was really like, it was like this mystique. It wasn't like science. It was like this old world that nobody knew about. And, I'm a curious kind of guy. And I started going to France and searching out these old bakers that were making pain au levain. I met Apollonia Poilin's grandfather. You know, of course, I knew her father, and I was friends with Basil Camire, and became friends with Bernard Ganichot and Jean-Luc Pougeron, and I kind of made my way around Paris, and I went to see Pierre Noury in the south of France, he's a Moffat mayor over de France, and so I would go visit all these people, and I would talk my way into visiting them and spending the night in the bakery, and I would learn firsthand how to make pain au levain, and how to make, how they would manage their sourdough or make their pain de seigle. And so it was a very personal experience for me. It wasn't like going to YouTube, which is great. I mean, there's so much information on YouTube now, but for me, I consider myself really lucky because I was learning from the way that people had learned to make sourdough bread for generations. You learn from somebody who had done it for a long time.
Yeah, and they have that more guild culture over there. And
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated when I hear this part of the story because I love these like the techniques of like how do you get a baker to like reveal their secrets, right? And I think you talk about in your book, you didn't actually discover secrets per se, but you found a lot of
No.
opinions. And how did you digest all that?
This is a story I tell quite often, but I think it's one of the best stories to talk about the nuance of sourdough baking. So I had these two favorite bakers. One baker made these incredibly refined, elegant loaves with the perfect dusting of flour, the perfect cuts, the perfect shapes. The color was always the same. I had this other baker was this wild, like eccentric baker, and the bread looked a little different every day, and it looked like almost like big pieces of lava that were, baked really dark and really gnarly, and like really like it touched you emotionally right away. And so I talked my way into the two bakers, and after getting to know them, I said, "Could you please share the recipe?" So finally, Baker One shares the recipe: 1,000 grams of Type 80 flour, 200 grams of sourdough, 780 grams of water, 22 grams of salt, and he talked me through the timing. Okay. A few weeks later, I go to Baker number two. I said, "Would you please share your recipe with me?" The breads could not have been more distinctively opposed in how they looked. I asked the baker number two for the recipe: 1,000 grams of flour, 780 grams of water, 200 grams of sourdough, 22 grams of salt. The recipes were identical, but the product was completely different.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And do you feel like as you were trying to understand what that meant, the differences, when you were watching them work, could you see the difference in like in terms of like how
Oh
intense
yeah,
they
yeah.
baked it?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, one guy used a spiral mixer, and he used a fairly young sourdough, and he was extraordinarily precise about everything in terms of scaling and mixing and dough temperature control. And this other guy was strict, but not as strict. And he had a 2-arm mixer, so he was mixing the dough for 22 minutes on slow speed. He would use this technique where instead of doing folds, he would just leave the dough in the mixer, and he had a timer on the mixer, and every 55 minutes the mixer would do a turn on its
Oh,
own.
interesting.
So he could be doing things. So like there was real nuances in the way they handled their dough that really indicated early on that the bread was going to be very different.
I feel like for people who geek out about bread or home bakers, maybe they consider opening up a little, micro bakery or something. Working with professional bakers is sort of like the next frontier. What do you talk to about with them to get them to bring you into the fold?
Well, it's a different world now. I mean, back then it was like a secret society.
Oh yeah?
Not that it was secret, but there were very few people interested in it.
Uh-huh.
I mean, right now I'm amazed at the information you get on YouTube. I mean, it's astounding the amount of you watch 10 videos on how to make sourdough bread on YouTube. The information is astounding. Okay, and in many cases it's right on. I have this young fellow who I've been mentoring a little bit, and he was asking me what would be the next step in his career. And as we don't have a lot of baking schools in the U.S., I suggested he go to the San Francisco Baking Institute, and he happens to be there right now. And every day he sends me an update. And this is someone who was a very serious kind of home baker, had a little micro bakery. And it's very interesting to hear his feedback, because one of the things they're doing in the class is they'll do a straight dough baguette with two different flours. One is 60% hydration, one is 62% hydration, one is 65% hydration. One is mixed sourdough and yeast, one is only sourdough. And it's really interesting to see his experience and his knowledge evolve, because he's going through in real time what many bakers go through in working with other bakeries. And you don't tend to see that in a YouTube video.
Yeah.
Like, okay, what is the difference between a 64% hydration and a 62% hydration? What's the difference between a 30-minute autolyse and a 1-hour autolyse? So, I think that like there's a ton of information out there on YouTube, but I'm a real advocate for taking classes and, really being in an environment where we're limited to what we can do at home.
Yeah. Yeah, that those points of contrast, I think there's people working on it, but it's still coming out. And yeah, and nobody's solved sourdough yet, in my opinion.
Well, no, and you know what? The first thing I would say, there's no perfect loaf.
Yeah.
One of the problems I have with the sourdough community. They say, oh, this person's bread is the best sourdough bread, or this is the best sourdough recipe. There is no best recipe. There's a really good recipe, and there's another really good recipe, but I just don't ever talk in those terms. Let's what's that Japanese term where they talk about 1% improvement every day? That's where I like to be.
Yeah.
Like, okay, this was a really good loaf of bread. Now, I don't want to be judgmental about it. I don't want to be critical about it, but is there room for the 1%?
Yeah.
What would that 1% be? I just love making it interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I advocate for the good enough loaf that,
Thank you.
nourishes you and your family and, enjoy making it a little bit better.
Exactly.
We don't want bread to stress us out. Like that's
No.
that's not the
Life
point
is stressful enough.
Yeah, totally. Another kind of contrast I see in the story of Bread Alone, which I don't know if you or your editor came up with the subtitle, but bold, fresh loaves from your own hands. I think that idea of like making something with your own hands is still a powerful idea even today.
Yep.
And I think it's not surprising this book is still in publication 30 years later.
33 years later.
33 years later. Okay. It's the story of the village baker. And I think if I remember correctly, part of the explosion of interest in Bread Alone was that you had a media moment. The New York Times wrote an article about you, and that probably helped lead to the book.
Yeah. Well, it didn't help. The New York Times article is the reason that I was offered a book.
All right. Thank you, New York Times. But you tell the story of you as a village baker, both working with your ovens and making stuff, and talk about your bakery. But part of being the village baker is a social aspect. It's like that dichotomy of being the solo person working in the bakery, making the bread every day, but then also interacting with your community and feeding people. And then on kind of the flip side, now post-retirement, where I know you still probably stop by and help in various ways at Bread Alone, but you've also transitioned now into a home baker role, and you're baking for yourself. Could you contrast that experience?
It was very interesting because once I retired and I was baking 1 or 2 loaves of bread at a time. It was actually hard for me in the beginning. It's like I was so used to thinking of 300 kilos of dough or 500 kilos of dough and how to process that dough in an efficient way, in an organized way. So I really had to slow myself down, and I really had to like tune up my micro senses. And I really enjoyed the process, although there were moments where like I felt a little uncomfortable, and now it's part of our daily life. There's a little restaurant in this town. I live way up in northern Maine now, in this tiny little town of 1,000 people, and one of the little restaurants in town bought a Simply Bread oven, and so I've been baking 20, 30 loaves of bread a day with the bakers there, and that's been quite fun.
Awesome. I used to live in New York City, and like Bread Alone is like kind of an institution there. If you go to the farmers markets, the green markets in the city, they always have a tent, and like, it's a very central part of the bread experience there. I wonder though, now that you live in Maine, if I'm Dan Leader's neighbor, do I get a loaf of your bread every now and then out of your home oven? Like, do you
well,
like...
no, but now this little restaurant in town, they've been baking like 40 loaves of bread every day. So lots of people in Castine, Maine are getting, I'm not making the bread, but it's certainly influenced by me.
So, okay. So you're sort of like becoming a micro baker again. So it's all starting over.
Exactly. Yeah. And actually the restaurant closes for the winter. And so I might be putting the oven in my basement. So I might actually have a little micro bakery for our neighbors here in Castine.
Wow.
But we're very lucky here because we've got some really great bakeries close by. Tenderhearth is 20 minutes away, and they make great bread. And you can go down in Portland. There's several good bakers. There's Night Moves. There's Zoo Baker. I mean, there's a lot of good bakers in Maine. So if all you have to do is scratch the surface, and you can find good bread here.
Yeah. So let me ask you: you've been writing books for 30 years. Like, you've seen everything change. Like, what have you hoped? What do you hope has been the impact of your books on bread culture, sourdough culture over these last 30 years?
I would say the first thing is, I was deeply influenced by Diet for a Small Planet, which came out when I was in high school, or even, when I was in high school, I think 71. And, I've always been an advocate for whole grains and, Whole Foods. And so, I mean, I would say the first thing, I'm so proud that I helped spread the word to working with whole wheat flour, to working with whole grains, to making simple, uncomplicated bread. I mean, sourdough bread is not, it's simple. It's a little complicated. The steps are complicated, but the process is pretty straightforward. So it's really satisfying that that book planted seeds all over Western Europe, United States, Australia, New Zealand, the English-speaking world. I still get emails and cards from people about that book and how much it's influenced their life. So, I mean, number one is having move that dial to get more people eating simple whole grain breads. That is the thing I am most proud of.
That's cool. I think that Slow Rise discusses like the local grain economy quite a bit. And you, just to get into some like technical stuff, so
Yeah.
for bakers who are listening, you do like to bring in those other kind of grains into the levain a lot in your
Yeah.
recipes rather than the main mix. Can you talk about like your rule of thumb for like working with like a grain and introducing it?
Yeah. So let me give you a perfect example. So when I learned to make miche or pain au levain, we were using type 80 flour all the way, meaning the sourdough was made from type 80 flour, the dough was made from type 80 flour. Well, now I do the same recipe, but sometimes I'll use 100% buckwheat in the sourdough. So I'm taking, buckwheat flour, I'm adding my sourdough to it, I'm adding water, I'm fermenting a buckwheat sourdough. And that is the foundation of my pain au levain. I might take half rye flour and half buckwheat flour. I might take type 80 flour, rye flour, spelt flour, and buckwheat flour in the sourdough. The recipe is essentially the same. Maybe the hydration changes 1% or 2%. But the difference in the flavor of the bread is like night and day. So, I mean, I think that's a really great example of what's different from when I learned to bake bread in 1983. Well, the color palette that I used in 1983 of flour was much more limited. Now I've got all these grains. Oh, wait a second. Maybe I'll put some grated ground flax seeds and sunflower seeds and millet in the sourdough. So all of a sudden, I'm not painting with 4 colors. I'm baking with 30 colors.
Yeah.
And 30 different flavors. And that's what I find super interesting today. And, this group that I studied with a little bit in France, a group called Les Ambassadeurs du Pain, they're making sourdough now with cracked whole grains. They're not even using flour. They're cracking whole grains. They're putting boiling water over it. They're adding 2% sourdough. They're letting it ferment for 24 hours, and that becomes the base of their bread. So all of a sudden, the foundations are all the same, but the ingredients are very different, and the final products, it's like a different food.
Totally. Yeah, that crack stuff, I haven't explored any of that yet. But these different kinds of grains, a lot of them behave differently.
But I also want to talk about something that behaves differently. One of the things I did in the book is I found small mills in every state in America.
Yeah.
Now, you've got some new mills in Texas. There's some new mills in Washington State. You certainly companies like Central Milling and La Milanese have become much bigger. But you've got Maine Grains is around, Farmer Ground. There's a wonderful spelt mill in Small Valley Mill in Pennsylvania. There's a new mill opening up in Northampton, Mass. I mean, we can go on and on. So now, wait a second. You've got all these new mills, all these different flours. Many of these mills are doing a European style identification, 100%, 85%. So all of a sudden the language is different. The flour's different. And so now, not only do we have this array of ingredients, we've got all these different flours, which is wonderful. But it also, if I go back to my early point about consistency, there's a balance. Like I get samples of flour from a lot of different mills. It takes practice to get used to a new flour. So is your goal to test as many new things as you can, or is your goal to have a really good loaf of bread every day? I mean, There's no right answer there. But, we have a lot of options now where we didn't years ago,
Yeah. Or if you're like me, you just use whatever you have in the cupboard and make
which
make
is
make
fine,
do. the
which is fine.
Yeah, totally. And it's also fascinating. I think with these, you can build this relationship with your obviously your local mill if you have one around
Yep.
you, and and go with them over the seasons because their flour will change year
Yep.
to year. And I think for the baker who's exploring local grains and fresh milled grains, home milling, you talk about the goal of baking bread as like the magnification of grains over the period of the
Hmm.
fermentation time and creating these like grain forward type breads. Do you feel like the levain is like, considering that there is like different qualities to fresh milled bread, it could be harder to work with, harder to shape, harder to get the hydration right, all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. Do you feel like introducing those things into the levain is a good first step for exploring new flours and new grains?
I think you kind of separate milling yourself at home
Uh-huh.
and using these local flours. I just finished a project a few months ago where we built a baking school with a full state-of-the-art lab designed to support the local flour mills so they can do accurate flour testing. It's at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York. But the reason I bring it up is, some of these small mills don't do testing on every batch of flour, which makes it problematic for the home baker because you don't know exactly how the flour is going to perform. And so this baking school and lab is designed so that mills can just send their grain to get tested very quickly, and then they can send to the baker the test results along with the flour. So this is, again, we talk about art, we talk about craft, and we talk about science. Then we're going to always go back and forth. No matter what we talk about today, there will be times we talk about strict science. There will be times we just talk about the craft, and there will be times that we talk about just your experience.
Yeah. I do feel like, especially with the wave of techie folks who, if on the West Coast, who are getting fascinated with sourdough, there's a lot more of that kind of mindset is coming to baking. There is a increased use of pH monitors, for instance, and
Hmm.
I do feel like like Europe will use different information on the bag of flours that you
Hmm.
buy. You have like ash,
Certainly in Italy.
yeah, and I wonder if that's coming, if that will be like the next wave.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like if you buy from Central Milling and you buy from Milanese, you can get that information, And I know that Farmer Ground Flour is doing that now. I know that Main Grains is. I think it's definitely coming. And they recently had a class at the Hartwick Baking Center where they had people come in from Chopin who make the Elviograph, and they ran through all the tests and they explained to people how to read an Elviograph, what is a Foley number, what do you do if the Foley number is out of whack? You know what I mean? So, like for example, if you have a really high Foley number, you need to add malt, for example.
Hmm.
So they're, diastatic malt. And so there's definitely a lot more technical information that is coming.
Yeah. And could you just describe for people who don't understand what a falling number is and what the malt will do to it? Like, could you describe what that
Okay.
is?
So a Foley number, they have this little beaker thing, and they mix a prescribed amount of flour and water and shake it up. They've got this little machine that shakes it up, and then they put this little piston in it. And the Foley number is the time that it takes that piston to go down. The more enzymatic activity, the slower it goes. And the Foley number is really important in terms of how stable your dough is. Okay. In some cases, how much gas it can hold. Okay. So if you take the Foley number and you have the Elviograph, it gives you a lot of information, mixing time, mixing tolerance, especially as you grow your bakeries. I mean, if you're making, 4 loaves of bread at home and you're folding it by hand, oh, wait a second, the dough doesn't feel as strong as it did last time. Well, I'll give it another fold. That information, like especially if you're in a bakery, having that technical information will certainly help you understand how long to knead your dough, especially if you're using a spiral mixer.
Right, right, right. And then the breads that you're making right now, what are those?
There's a simple sourdough, very similar to the pain au levain. I made 30, bread alone. We started in 83, so that's a long time. It's very similar, except I'm having them use a liquid sourdough
Uh-huh.
instead of a firm levain.
Okay. And why is that?
Just because it's easier for them.
Okay.
I have them feeding the sourdough twice a day,
Uh,
and they feed it at night. They let it sit out for 2 hours, and they put it in the fridge, and they come in the morning, and you know what I mean.
uh,
So we have a little schedule set out for them,
uh,
and it's just a little easier to maintain the liquid starter than the firm starter.
all right, right. Sticking with the classics. When this comes out, like the holidays will be ahead. How does bread fit into your like holiday life? Do you have anything special you like to make?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'll make some holiday fruit breads. I like making some German kind of sweetbreads, Kugelhof, or now we've got a panettone craze going on in the world.
Yeah.
I remember when the panettone, like, there was another product that nobody knew about, and now everyone's making panettone.
Yeah. Which I admit I don't really love. Maybe I haven't had a really great one.
It's listen, it's a sweetbread.
Yeah, but I think people like the challenge, right? And like
Oh
that's
yeah,
the, that's the thing. I'm just poking through your book here, and you have a variety. For people who are looking for holiday recipes, there are a variety of everything from croissants and
between the four books, there's loads of
yeah,
recipes.
you'll find something that you need for the holiday table. When you were writing your first book, how did you figure out how you wanted to make that?
I had a editor who said to me, now you have to remember, I'd only been baking bread for just a few years, and I had just visited a few bakers. I was still in the early stages of like figuring this whole thing out.
Right.
And my editor said to me, only write about what you know. I couldn't, what was going on in my bubble thought in my head, well, that's going to create a problem because I don't know much. like I'm still figuring this out. I hadn't been to baking school.
Mhm.
I didn't have, a certificate aptitude professionnel from France. I was like this guy just trying to figure it out. And so when she told me that, well, the only thing I knew well was my experiences visiting the farmers in North Dakota, going to the bakers in France, building the brick oven, learning to make sourdough on my own. So in some ways, it was the best advice that she could have given me because it made me like, what do I know? I know I'm not a guy who can bake every bread on the planet. I know that I don't have all the technical skills, but I had a lot of curiosity. So I think that when you go back and read Bread Alone now, it's like this young guy who's just trying to figure it out. How does this whole thing work? Is it the wheat that's more important? Is it the sourdough that's more important? Is it the mill that's more important? Is it the baking technique that's more important? I didn't have a clue.
Do you feel like you have it figured out now?
More than that, that's for sure.
um, yeah, well, I think that's always a powerful teaching. I had a teacher once who told me you always want to be one step ahead of your student, and I think one thing that makes a book like Bread Alone accessible is like I think most of us who are trying to figure things out, we recognize that search.
I mean, one of the most flattering things that I've ever experienced is I was actually invited recently to help a French bakery develop some products in Western France.
Wow.
And for me to go to France now and have a workshop with a bunch of, this is kind of a large bakery that's trying to make some specialty products. And so here I'm working with a bunch of very skilled, I don't want to call them industrial, but production bakers and saying, wait a second, if you have to think differently when you're doing this process. And for me to go to France now and to share my knowledge there in Germany and Italy, it's just like, that to me is like the greatest feeling I could ever imagine.
Totally full circle. And then you are somebody who goes out and like knocks on doors and gets the core information. When you look around at the cookbooks in the world, bread books, what books have inspired you over the years as you've continued to grow as a baker and an author?
I mean, so many of them. I mean, Peter Reinhardt's books, certainly Chad's books. We were speaking earlier about Richard Hart, the new baker from who's getting a lot of buzz and who worked with Noma. I mean, it's just a lot of A lot of Nancy Silverton's books. I think the books out of Washington, the Modernist Bread Book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of these books, they all have something valuable. I think you could probably buy 20 bread books in the last 10 years and have all the information you would need for a lifetime.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I feel like as somebody who's always loved cookbooks, you feel that way, and then somebody comes up with something new. And it's like,
Totally.
oh, okay, let's see where that goes. I am excited to see what continues to bubble up. Well, it's been really interesting to spend some time with you and to pick your brain and to hear about your story. I really appreciate, like, even before I was baking, like all this information you've been figuring out and sharing, just the effort you continue to put into expand everyone's knowledge and raise awareness of different aspects of baking and the connections from the farm to the mill to the kitchen and to the bakery
And to the home, if I could just
yeah.
end on this note. So when I heard about your company, long before we met,
Uh-huh.
I saw it on the internet or something, and I ordered your little sourdough thing.
Hmm.
And I was like, I just wonder how this works. Like, is it really going to be as good as people are saying? And I have to say, like, it improved my home sourdough baking.
All right.
I didn't, I have an Aga stove where I would ferment my sourdough before.
Uh-huh.
The burners are hot, and so I had this place by the Aga stove where I would put my little beaker of sourdough, and if I got it just right, it would be the perfect rise in 5 hours. Well, your little
Little
gadget
Goldie.
made
Yeah.
that process easier. So, I mean, I'm just saying that I'm always digging a little bit,
Yeah.
on a large scale and a small scale.
Oh, I appreciate that.
It's a great product, and it helped me refine my sourdough baking at home.
You're making my head swell. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna end it there. Just another shout out for a slow rise, as well as the all six of Daniel's books, where you can get lots of recipes for your holiday feast, as well as real insight into just kind of how bread has grown in the United States over the last 30 some years, 33 years. And if people want to learn more about you today, pick up some bread locally.
If you want information on Bread Alone, you go to breadalone.com. If you want information on me, danleader.com. Dan Makes Bread is my Instagram, although I'm not a big social media person. And I love getting emails and messages from people with bread questions. And I'm pretty good about responding. So anyone who has questions, I'm always happy to help.
Awesome. So reach out. And you can, if you want to learn more about Sour House, you can find us at sourhouse.co and Life at Sour House on the Instagram and everything. Well, thank you, Dan. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in and listened to this episode. And it's great to talk to you.
See you, Eric. Thank you.